Snow had already swallowed the slope when the mattress cover began to take on color. Against the white, the stain was immediate and terrible, a stark, spreading red that turned a makeshift shroud into a signal of wound and will. Below Hill 616, on a bitter January morning in 1945, a single non-commissioned officer would turn that small, dark smear into the hinge on which an entire company's fate swung. How this walking grenade defied German machine gun fire and neutralized 3 MG-42 nests alone began in white cold and pain, and ended in a quiet, complicated kind of salvation. The date was January 8, 1945. The place was a steep, snow-packed rise on the edge of the Vosges Mountains. Company the Furriers of the 142nd Infantry lay pinned in a shallow valley beneath timbered emplacements and overlapping fields of fire. Winter had carved the world down to 2 tones, sky and snow. The temperature hovered near 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow depth ran up to 18 inches. The slope above them tilted at roughly 40 degrees, a frozen mouth that belched lead and burst upon anyone foolish enough to cross it. 3 German machine gun positions, each built into the slope with timber revetments and firing slits, sowed the hillside with deadly arcs. Retreat was not an option. The platoon could not advance. Men lay exposed to continuous punishing bursts from what would be the central instrument of pain that morning, the MG-42, a German general-purpose machine gun, capable of extremely high cyclic fire. Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham stood among those pinned men. He was a leader whose men looked to him for movement and decision when the line of sight and orders broke into noise. His platoon had already taken losses in the Vosges campaign. Casualties and exhaustion had thinned the unit's margin for error. The tactical problem was brutal in its simplicity. The 3 machine guns commanded the slope, and any attempt to climb the hill would be shredded before it reached the timber emplacements. Artillery would not correct the situation in time. The company's mortality there was immediate. One accurate sweep could cut down a line that still held nearly 120 Americans in that killing zone. Dunham did not have an artillery officer's resources or a battalion commander's time. What he had was a decision and a set of basic tools: the M1 carbine slung at his hip, a lightweight semi-automatic rifle typically carried with 15-round magazines, a handful of grenades, and improvisation born of necessity. He improvised white camouflage by tearing a mattress cover into a long, shrouding strip to break the outline of his dark uniform against the snow. He stuffed his pockets and blouse with magazines and grenades until his clothing felt like a pack. A dozen magazines, a dozen Mark II fragmentation grenades, the standard U.S. defensive grenade of the day, and whatever rounds he could carry. The load added weight, roughly calculated by his men later at about 72 pounds when taken with extra clothing and ammunition, but it also supplied options that a pinned soldier required: bullets for suppression, and grenades for close work against emplacements that could not be untouched by small arms fire. He began the crawl. Crawling uphill under deliberate fire was not a single motion, but a sequence of small, measured gains. Dunham's advance unfolded in micro-beats of movement and waiting. 3 body lengths under a lull, a strip of snow gained while an MG-42 conversely chewed off a strip of air, a hand finding a crust and pushing, then freezing as tracers snapped past. Breath condensing in rhythm with listening. He moved when the gunners paused between firing, and he buried himself in snowbanks when the guns resumed. The first 75 yards of that climb took him 18 minutes. 18 minutes of inching through white, 18 minutes of a man counting the tilt of terrain and shifts in the machine gun's muzzle flash, 18 minutes of slipping and refinding purchase on a slope that threatened to throw him back with every motion. As he crawled, his fingers went numb and his gloves filled with wet. Snow soaked into his improvised cover, and the mattress fabric became heavy and muffled. It masked his dark uniform, but also clung to him like an additional weight. He lost track of time in the tight equation of forward movement versus fire. The snow around him turned granular from the pressure of men and shells. The slope itself recorded every step with small avalanches of powdery drift. At roughly the 75-yard mark, he made a decision that would turn immediate survival into action. He rose from his crawl and charged. To stand was to invite the hill's full attention, but standing also allowed movement that crawling could not achieve: sprinting, aiming, and the throwing of grenades with a force and arc impossible from the belly. He stood, and the surface of the day erupted. Almost immediately a rifle round found his back. The bullet tore a 10-inch gash across muscle and cloth, a wound broad enough to pour warmth into the white. He felt the burn and the damp of blood against the mattress cover and the snow. The cut was deep and ugly in its efficiency. It could have ended much more badly. The bullet passed close to the spine, closer than preference allowed, and the physics of the shot left him lucky, in the brute sense of the word. Within seconds, a German grenade, thrown from the nearest emplacement, landed at his boots and skittered under his foot. Instinct and training met there. He kicked the live grenade free with a single decisive sweep of his foot. It rolled away and detonated harmlessly in the drift. Pain, however, did not end the threat. Across a few yards, the first MG-42 nest sat protected by an earthen berm and timber. The MG-42 barked in vicious staccato, a sound that a man's nervous system refused to let be normal. Dunham's carbine and his training took over. He fired an initial burst, emptying a magazine in the flash of a single firefight burst. 30 rounds disappearing in less than a half-minute of suppressive exchange. The period of time the gunner could concentrate on a target before recoil and relocation forced a pause. The gunner's feed did not cease. It simply met a different threat. In that close-quarters space, his M1 carbine's accuracy mattered more than a high volume of fire. He used aimed shots to pick out the bunker slit and any silhouette showing in its shadow. When the dust settled near that first position, 3 men lay neutralized and 1 survived to be taken prisoner at point-blank range. Dunham had used his carbine until it stood empty in his hands. There was no triumph in that act, only the precise, graceless transformation of threat into neutralization and the immediate knowledge that 2 other nests still held fire over the slope. He reloaded and moved again. The slope had become a sequence of small objectives, one bunkered gun after another. He measured each approach in seconds and breaths, in the click of his magazine seated and the weight of his helmet against his temple. Where standing had carried him for the first emplacement, crawling resumed for the next. He re-entered the snow and used its white field to blur his outline. For the second MG-42 position, Dunham closed to a range where hand-thrown explosives would be decisive. He had prepared for this. Inside his coat were the grenades that would tilt the axis of fire. From the moment he made his first assault to the moment he employed explosive force, the mathematics of action reduced to timing. He waited for the gunner to shift his aim or to rebreathe from a long burst. Then he thrust himself forward, drew 2 Mark II grenades, and brought them to bear in rapid sequence. The first landed inside the bunker's firing slit. The second followed, intended to ensure destruction and to neutralize any survivor who might have been sheltered from the incoming fragmentation. When they detonated, timber and earth answered with a dull, violent language, and the slope's geometry changed slightly as debris and snow slid from the impact. Supporting riflemen, enemies arrayed in pockets around the machine gun positions, were either killed or suppressed. A handful were taken prisoner by troops who crawled up behind him through the freed lane. By the time he had dealt with the second nest, the cost of action was physical in a way that no adrenaline could hide. Blood soaked further into the mattress fabric at his back. Heat drained from his limbs. His breathing had become a labor. But the third and highest emplacement still commanded the greatest angle and the most lethal arc over the valley. It sat like a last tooth at the crest of the hill. Smaller, but it controlled the field from the top. Approaching that final position demanded a new kind of timing. The MG-42's bursts were predictable in their rhythm, but the gunner varied the intervals to complicate targeting. Dunham learned the cadence by listening. In the pauses, he advanced. He counted the rhythm of the staccato, paced his breaths to match the gaps, and used them for motion. He had, by his own tally and later corroboration, expended a total of 11 grenades during the action. By now, ammunition was a ledger on his person. Magazines gone, magazines remaining, rounds fired and rounds to spare. When he reached a point where the final bunker's slit opened to receive a thrown explosive, he timed his move. 2 grenades went through the slit of the third emplacement. Deliberately, closely aimed, their arcs matched to the narrow opening in the timber. The explosions ripped at the bunker's interior, destroying the gun and its mechanism, and neutralizing the crew inside. Timber splintered. The position that had rained death down the slope for hours ceased to function. In the immediate moments that followed, he moved into point-blank clearing, engaging with his carbine at the very edge of the bunker's mouth. A supporting rifleman, likely startled by the sudden collapse of the machine's covering fire, rose and presented himself at the very range where Dunham's weapon found him. The encounter ended with that combatant neutralized. When the firing finally subsided across the slope, the calculus of the action could be tallied with grim precision. Dunham had fired roughly 175 rounds during the assault. He had thrown 11 grenades. He had neutralized the 3 machine gun positions and had either killed or captured the men manning them. The lane he had carved up the hill opened like a wound that let heat and air back into the valley. The immediate tactical effect was decisive. The men of Company the Fouan, whose bodies and lives had been in direct line of the emplacements, were no longer under continuous enfilade. One report later counted that roughly 120 soldiers were granted the opportunity to withdraw or to reorganize because of the cleared slope, an action that very likely prevented a much higher casualty count during the hours that followed. There was no dramatic cinematic moment of applause at the hill's crest. The real sound after the gunners fell was a different kind of quiet, the low, shocked breathing of men who had expected death and found instead motion. The rasp of those same men digging in or staggering toward cover. The distant, continuing sound of artillery that a good battle never entirely quite stops, even when one immediate problem has been solved. Medics moved toward Dunham with a speed that respected both the danger and the need. They packed his wound. In the field dressing and the rush of cloth and sulfa ointment, they did the urgent work required to keep him from bleeding out. Later, after evacuation to a field hospital, surgeons would stitch the wound with 43 sutures. The record marks how close the bullet had come to paralyzing him, and how much the hands of those surgeons mattered. For the men watching on that slope, however, the immediate calculus was simpler. One man had taken a path up where none were supposed to be able to move, opened a lane, and allowed a company to breathe. His refusal to leave the hill immediately for a definitive medical evacuation was not show or bravado as much as utility. He insisted on staying with his men until they were moved to safer positions. That decision meant that medics could only do so much on the spot. It also meant that his blood soaked the mattress material down to the snow, and that the red stain, first noted as it began to spread, stayed visible long enough for the photographers and the stretcher teams who later documented the day. In the calculus of combat the day, modesty and mission often blended indistinguishably. A man tries not to be lifted off a contest his men still need him in. The aftermath of the assault established 2 interleaving narratives. One was immediate and tactical. Company I had been freed from a lethal bottleneck and could consolidate its position without the same immediate threat. The assault had removed the 3 critical points of enfilade and saved the lives directly beneath them. The other narrative was personal. A young technical sergeant had survived a near-fatal wound, had acted with improvisation and aggression, and now faced a sequence of treatments and recoveries that would stretch well beyond the single day. When official reports reached divisional echelons, they read like the wiring diagram of audacity. A man had climbed 75 yards through snow and gunfire, had stood and taken a wound, had neutralized multiple positions with a combination of rifle fire and grenades, and had allowed a company to escape immediate destruction. The raw numbers, 75 yards in 18 minutes, 11 grenades expended, 175 rounds fired, a 10-inch back gash, began to circulate in after-action statements and in the recommendations that would flow from the field up the chain of command. Those numbers afforded credibility, not a myth or a rumor, but a ledger of what had to be believed because men had counted and documented the action. Even as the immediate medical work continued, men began to describe the tactile moments that mattered to them. How the mattress cloth muffled snow, how the MG-42's voice was different at close range, how small the margin for error had been. The MG-42 itself had a reputation. Its high cyclic rate could cut down a squad in seconds, and its crew could lay down suppression that transformed open ground into a no-man's land within heartbeats. Against that mechanical ferocity, a handful of grenades and a carbine seemed almost insufficient. Yet a man who knew his enemy's cadence and who accepted the risk could exploit the pauses between bursts and find movement where none seemed possible. Tactical clarity did not erase pain. Dunham's wound bled freely and deeply. The wound's contour and proximity to spinal structures complicated both field dressing and the later surgical repair. Sulfa powder, the era's staple antiseptic for battlefield wounds, was applied. Medics worked to staunch bleeding and to prevent infection. The surgeons later remarked that their swift closing of tissue and the prompt application of antibiotics likely saved him not only from a long infection, but from permanent disability. These medical details are not heroics in the heroic sense. They are, instead, a reminder that survival in war depends as much on proximate care as on courageous acts. One fact remained stubbornly true. The hill had been taken in a single-man sequence of moves. The company's men would later speak of being given a second chance that morning, and historians would record the action as an extreme instance of small unit initiative and personal bravery. But for those who had been pinned, the action felt less like legend and more like a practical removal of immediate danger. The gap in the enemy's fire corridors allowed movement, the stretch of men to collectively reorganize and withdraw, and the medics to operate with less risk. Beyond the tactical, the picture of a white mattress cover going red in snow had lodged itself in the collective memory of the unit and would become the opening image of any retelling. It was also the image that made it difficult to reconcile the action with the ordinary life that would later follow. Dunham did not seek publicity. He returned to duty as soon as he could walk with purpose and continued to serve through subsequent operations. The war would not let the story of Hill 616 remain contained to one day. The campaign through the Vosges had broader contours: attrition, fractured supply lines, and a German defense that was determined and occasionally clever in its use of terrain and timber emplacements. Small unit actions had outsized influence in such context, and a single sergeant's climb could tip the balance of a local engagement in a way that few higher-level maneuvers could accomplish quickly. For the soldiers who watched the slope that day, the soundscape once dominated by machine gun staccato receded to a background roar of artillery and the distant questions of winter warfare: how to move, how to consolidate, and how to keep bodies warm and wounds clean. The men who were freed by the slope's clearing did not immediately conceptualize their fate in the language of medals or citations. They thought of stretcher bearers, of coffee cups passed in the snow, of the comfort of flannels and sulfa, and of the personal, private tasks of shoring up the living against the dead and the dying. When the higher commands compiled reports, a recommendation for the Medal of Honor moved up the chain. Those documents insisted on exactitude: times, distances, the quantity of munitions expended, the number of enemy positions neutralized, and they did not flatter. They attached a record to what had happened on the slope. The recommendation would move eventually to a process that included scrutiny by division and corps commanders before reaching the Army and finally the White House. But bureaucratic certitude did not alter the immediate human truth on the slope. Men were alive because a sergeant had decided to act, and then to keep acting when injury might have been a signal to stop. By the time flatbed ambulances and litter bearers could move him from the snowy incline, the wound had been packed and the bleeding controlled. He refused, as much as he could, to let the action end his part in it. He wanted to remain with his men while their positions were stabilized. It was not a dramatic refusal, but a functional one. He understood that his presence mattered for the unit's morale and organization. Field surgeons would later tally the sutures and the grafting necessary to repair the damage. For now, though, the red stain on white fabric, the mattress cover, remained a witness to the morning's violence, its color a stark and untranslatable measure of cost. If the assault on Hill 616 closed one chapter, it opened another question that weighed on the minds of commanders and survivors alike. What would the winter campaign do next? The Vosges winter would continue to make men confront the arithmetic of exposure, supply, and small unit initiative. The operational rhythm of the sector still involved counterattacks, armored probes, and days when German tanks and infantry would press the lines hard enough to force mass movements, or even captures. The road ahead, in other words, was not a simple downhill march to safety. For Dunham, the wound on his back was the first in a series of wounds that would test the boundaries of survival, and the first in a sequence that would eventually put him in situations stranger than most battlefield narratives. For now, however, the immediate story remained. A man had improvised a white cover, had filled his clothing with ammunition, had crawled tens of yards in nearly 20 minutes, had stood and been cut but kept moving, had kicked away a grenade, had thrown 11 grenades in total, had fired roughly 175 rounds, and had cleared 3 MG-42 positions. The immediate math was simple, but shocking in its scale. The human consequences stretched far beyond the arithmetic. It was a measure of the day that photographers and reporters would later fix the mattress fabric and the stain as a shorthand for the chaos and discipline of that assault. But inside the storm of fire, the assault had been nothing like an image. It had been a concatenation of decisions made in seconds, of a man choosing exposure over stasis, and of the stubborn calculus that sometimes animates survival. Move now, because waiting will be worse. The valley beneath Hill 616 had a different future after that morning, at least for the men of Company the Fur. The slope would remain a contested and dangerous place, but the immediate paralyzing choke point had been severed. When the company reorganized, men exchanged names again after the blackout of firefights. They counted their own. They placed candles, in their private way, around the memory of the day, small acts of human recognition for lives spared and for those who had died. The weight of what had happened was not something that could be entirely explained by numbers. Numbers only set a frame. The rest was carried in bodies and in the quiet conversations in a lee of timber about who had run and who had been brave, and in the looks that men gave each other as they sat with their packs and the taste of metal in their mouths. Only later would the formal machinery of recognition take note. The recommendation for a Medal of Honor made its way forward, officials annotated the report, and the chain of command ensured that the action was documented with precision. But in those hours on the slope, documentation mattered less than the fact that men were moving again instead of lying frozen under fire. The difference between heroism and a simple brutal act of utility is often a single moment of choice. That morning, when the mattress cover bled red into white snow, the choice was made, and the slope answered. If the assault had an immediate ending, 3 guns stopped and a company freed, its consequences were not finished. The wound required surgery, the unit required reorganization, and the campaign in the Vosges required constant vigilance. For Dunham personally, the stitches and the hours in triage would mark only the beginning of a sequence of survival tests. There would be a capture and escape not far removed in time, and there would be a slow, painful process of recovery that still allowed him to return to action. Those sequences were not yet in full motion on that cold January morning, but the seeds were there. The wounding, the refusal to be removed from duty, the determination that would later feed daring choices under even more desperate circumstances. Before any of that could unfold, however, the wounded man's immediate problem was the same as the unit's. Get off the slope in a way that minimized further casualties, treat the wound to prevent infection, and secure the position against German countermeasures. Medics applied sulfa and closed the wound at the field level. Later, surgeons at a better-equipped facility would place 43 stitches and confirm that spinal contact had been narrowly avoided. The facts were clinical and precise, and the men who recorded them did so without the flourish of legend. But the human reality, the mattress, the stain, the cold, and the sound, remained a kind of shorthand that the survivors carried with them. If you appreciate detailed military history in long form and want to see more deep dives like this one, consider subscribing. There's a lot more to this campaign and this man's story worth preserving. For the moment, though, Hill 616 had been a place of immediate salvation and immediate cost. The company consolidated, stretchers moved, medics smelled of iodine and sulfa. The mattress cover lay damp and dark against the snow and then, eventually, was carried away as documentation and as a piece of evidence that singular events can turn a battle's direction. The slope would be recalled by men who were there as a place where time telescoped, 20 minutes that contained a battle, an infantryman's wound, and a lane of escape. What remained after the stretcher-bearers took their loads and the surgeons stitched was not only a man's diminished blood, but a record that would move through army offices and across the channels of formal recognition. Recommendations and reports would press outward from the valley to command posts and to the records that build a soldier's public legacy. Yet the private arithmetic of the men who had been there, who had watched a mattress cover bloom red and then watched the slope go quiet, was more complicated than any citation could capture. They knew they had been saved from immediate destruction. They also knew the cost carried forward, wounds to be treated, nerves to be settled, and a campaign yet to be fought. The assault on Hill 616 closed a violent interval and opened new questions about endurance, leadership, and the human costs of initiative under fire. Dunham's actions that day solved an immediate tactical problem, but they also set in motion a series of events, medical, administrative, and personal, that would test the same qualities of grit and improvisation in different ways. The next chapters of his story required recovery, and then, not long after, another test of survival that took place beyond the slope's snow and under the even more precarious conditions of encirclement and capture. Those events would further complicate what it meant to survive in the winter of 1945, and would ensure that the image of a mattress cover in the snow remained only a single frame in a longer, more dangerous reel. Winter's pressure did not relent after Hill 616. 2 weeks later, the same cold that had polished the slope into a mirror for lead turned the front into a tighter trap. On January 22, 1945, Company Y found itself face to face with the brutal arithmetic of winter warfare and German mechanized thrusts. Armored vehicles punched through thin lines, cutting routes of retreat and forcing pockets of infantry into small clearings where movement meant death. In those hours, positions collapsed with a speed that stunned men hardened by months of fighting. The valley that had seemed a place of consolidation grew perilous again. Dunham's unit was overrun in the heavier chaos. Where a deliberate assault had opened a lane for movement on the 8th, now the enemy's armored probes and infantry maneuvers created sudden encirclements. Mass surrender became a practical choice for many of the men who could see no reasonable alternative to being crushed or captured under track and tread. Dunham made a different calculation. He slipped away from the crowd of soldiers stepping into German detention, moving through back alleys of timber and wreckage until he reached a farmhouse whose cellar held wooden barrels used for storing sauerkraut. The barrel was not an artifact of strategy, it was a desperation choice. He crawled into one whose lid had been removed, lowered himself into the fermented brine and shredded cabbage, and pulled the rim down to seal the top as best as he could. The barrel's cramped interior smelled of salt, acid, and the sour tang of long-preserved food. It was warm compared to the outside air, which was a small comfort. It also soaked the back wound that had not yet fully clothed with scar tissue. For 13 hours he lay with his wounded back pressed against wood and brine, the liquid stinging raw flesh and the cold leaching softness from his limbs. The sauerkraut smell became a near-constant presence. A kitchen odor turned claustrophobic, an almost comic counterpoint to the violence around him. He could hear distant German voices, the scuff of boots, and then the hard, metallic sound of searches happening across the farmhouse. Hiding in improvised places was not unusual in Wyatt. The absurdity of survival often sat next to the sacred. In that barrel, Dunham's motion was measured and minimal. Every shift increased the risk of detection. Every breath might have been betrayed by the faint creak of aging staves. When night narrowed to the ribs of the morning, when searchlights edged closer with a persistent sweep, he thought the hiding would end one way or another. At dawn he was discovered. The Germans pried him out, wet and smelling of brine, and for a moment the long calculation of saving himself reversed into the simpler arithmetic of capture. Captured men were gathered and moved toward a temporary holding area, and then onto vehicle transport. During that short interval, an opportunity presented itself, one born from confusion and poor guard discipline rather than careful planning. While being escorted to a German transport, 2 guards moved within reach of a sudden, violent impulse of self-preservation. Dunham, still carrying a Colt M1911 pistol, the standard issue, .45 caliber sidearm common to American NCOs, used the weapon with brutal economy. He killed 2 guards in the vehicle, expending 4 rounds in the process, then opened a small window of escape as the truck slowed or its attention drifted. He slipped free into the snowy line of trees and disappeared into the woods with the pistol and the remaining 4 rounds he had calculated as his escape edge. The flight into the woods was not cinematic in the heroic sense. There were no flawless, clean beats, only the ragged, hungry rhythm of a man running on adrenaline and the thin fuel of survival. Trees blurred past his arms. Breath became steam. Snowbite stiffened fingers that had already known damp and cold. He moved by instinct and memory, avoiding open ground, following drainage ditches and small ravines that masked footprints and muffled sound. Each nightfall he buried himself under brush or in shallow hollows, trusting the snow to do what it had done for him before: muffle, conceal, insulate. The next 3 days were an exercise in endurance against a winter that had become a second enemy. Frostbite crept into the toes and heels. His feet, already taxed by marches and frozen hours, threatened to turn from instruments of movement into liabilities. Hunger gnawed with the steadiness of a clock. Thirst was a constant possibility when snow could be melted but not safely cooked. Infection was an ever-present specter, not least because the back wound, once packed and sutured, had been exposed to brine and barn bacteria. Sulfa and early antibiotics could do much, but when medical care was distant and movement constant, infection could progress faster than treatment. He survived on a combination of scant rations scavenged from abandoned shelters and the careful rationing of body energy. At times he drifted into hypothermic stupor and had to force himself into motion. He relied on small tricks, pressing palms to the belly for heat, using the mattress fabric remnants wrapped about the torso to conserve warmth, limiting movement to keep blood from pooling in cold extremities. The pistol's 4 rounds were a psychological lifeline and a practical tool. They were also the last ammunition he had after the Hill 616 engagements and the later skirmishes. When at last he encountered elements of his own side, engineers working a bridge or a small patrol, they were exhausted, suspicious, and practical. He stumbled toward them, a man in rags and staining fabric, incoherent at times from cold and fever, and was taken in. Surgeons at the field facility examined him and found a combination of fresh trauma and complications. The back wound from Hill 616 had been stitched, 43 sutures in the prior operation, and the wound itself had flirted with infection after its exposure to the sauerkraut brine. His feet, suffering early to severe frostbite, flirted with the possibility of amputation. The surgeon's work was decisive. They debrided damaged tissue, applied antiseptic sulfa treatments, and used the era's surgical techniques to salvage what could be saved. Records from the treating hospitals later noted that the surgeon's prompt actions had likely prevented a far worse outcome, and the rehabilitation that followed required months of physical therapy and slow reconditioning. For Dunham, the physical cost was matched by another ledger: the psychological residue of being captured, of killing 2 guards to escape, and of surviving with body parts near loss. When the immediate danger had been addressed and his condition had stabilized, the Army's machinery for recognition returned to the Hill 616 action. The recommendation had been filed earlier. It moved through the same channels that had recorded the assault's granular details: distances crawled, grenades thrown, rounds expended, and men incapacitated or taken prisoner. After the verification and the review, the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor, was scheduled for presentation. On April 23, 1945, in the shadow of a Europe shifting rapidly toward the war's end, Technical Sergeant Russell Dunham received the medal. The ceremony took place in a formal setting, with the gravity such honors demanded. Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presented the award. Contemporaneous accounts recorded that Patch underscored the extraordinary courage displayed, an acknowledgement made in public and recorded in official dispatches, an attempt by senior leadership to frame the action within the Army's larger narrative of determination and sacrifice. Dunham accepted the medal with the same guarded modesty that had marked his actions on the battlefield. He did not seek the limelight. Those who watched him in the years after the war noted that he repeatedly deflected praise and emphasized the ordinary demands of duty. To veterans and to the public he told, in paraphrase if not in epigram, that he had done what was necessary to keep his men alive. That posture, of humility, might have been a survival mechanism, or it might have reflected a deeper discomfort with being held up as singular when the battlefield's outcomes were the product of countless unnamed acts. Whatever the motivation, Dunham's public persona remained steady, a man uncomfortable with hero worship and attentive to the quieter obligations veteran life pressed upon him. Post-war, he carved a life away from headlines. He worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs, a career that used the skills of organized service in a peacetime setting, administration, advocacy, and the daily grind of helping a population whose needs were often as complex as they were invisible. That work allowed him to stay connected to the practical concerns of veterans, medical claims, rehabilitation, and benefits, without turning the past into a spectacle. He lived modestly, a pattern consistent with many recipients of the Medal of Honor who preferred the company of their families and the steady rhythm of work to the disruption of fame. He married, settled into civilian routines, and tried to rebuild an ordinary life in the shadow of extraordinary memory. The medical and psychological after-effects were not erased by medals or ceremonial applause. The wound on his back, the areas of scar tissue, the lingering numbness or stiffness in his limbs. These were reminders that survival did not mean the end of consequence. His feet, saved by surgeons, required patience and care for years. The moments of illness and recovery were sometimes private, sometimes bureaucratic, and sometimes banal. Appointments with doctors, the small humiliations of dependence during convalescence, and the steady, leveling work of reintegration. In interviews and in the remembering of veterans, Dunham's story was often headline summarized in a single arresting image. The mattress cover dyed red in snow, a lone man taking on 3 machine gun nests. That image endured because it captured a terrible logic succinctly, one human decision altering an immediate future for many others. But the fuller story, of hiding in a barrel, of killing to escape, of 3 days of flight across frozen land, of surgeons sewing flesh back together, complicated the tidy hero narrative. It showed how valor and survival braided with chance and cost. The historical appraisal of his action did not simply lionize him. Military historians use the episode as a case study in small unit initiative, in the tactical exploitation of weapon rhythms, and in the potential for individual agency to shape moments within larger operations. Small details became textbook footnotes: the timing of MG-42 bursts and how a soldier could exploit the pauses, the use of defensive grenades to defeat bunkered positions, the limits of small arms fire against revetted timber emplacements. The action at Hill 616 entered the catalog of instructive episodes for infantry doctrine, not as an argument to encourage needless solo assaults, but as proof that audacity, when matched with training and timing, could sometimes produce disproportionate effects. For commanders and students of tactics, the event was a caution as much as an inspiration. Personal initiative must be balanced with the risk to the force and with the realities of terrain, enemy capability, and supporting fires. Dunham's life after the war also illustrated another recurring theme: the tension between public recognition and private consequence. Receiving the Medal of Honor was a recognition of extraordinary conduct under extraordinary danger. Yet medals do not always translate into easy living. Veterans' adjustment to peacetime required both external support and internal navigation of memory. In his years with the VA and in his community, Dunham advocated for the needs of those who returned from battle with wounds both seen and unseen. He carried his experiences into that work without elevating himself above those he served. By the time of his death in 2009, the narrative of the Hill 616 assault had entered popular military memory as one of the remarkable single-handed episodes of the Second World War. Historians, writers, and fellow soldiers continued to tell the story because it encapsulated a set of wartime extremes: improvisation under fire, the brute arithmetic of cold and wound, the close margins between survival and catastrophe, and the moral ambiguities that sometimes accompanied desperate choices. The walking grenade epithet, an image that suggested a man moving like an explosive element among fixed emplacements, served as a provocative shorthand. It captured the mix of dangerous proximity and improvisational lethality that defined the assault. But it was never the whole man. Behind that nickname lay the human realities of stitches and infection, of hiding where one could find shelter, of killing to live, and of a long, slow healing afterward. There are lessons in his story that outlast medals and images. One is tactical and immediate. Knowledge of one's weapons and the enemy's systems, coupled with the courage to exploit pauses in the fight, can change outcomes in ways that paperwork and doctrine sometimes underestimate. Another is institutional. The systems that recognize valor are necessary, but also insufficient to address the long-term consequences of combat. A third is moral. Courage in battle often sits beside acts that survive only in private memory, choices made with the ground shifting beneath one's feet and with the lives of others trembling in the balance. If Hill 616 provided a dramatic focus, the episodes that followed, the barrel, the morning capture, the killing of 2 guards to regain freedom, the 3 days of evasion and near loss of feet, completed the picture of survival in extremis. They revealed how close the war's edges often were. A man who had opened a lane for others one morning could find himself in a barrel the next. And then within dawn's light face, the last-ditch decision to kill or be taken. Those decisions did not sit comfortably on the chest of memory. They pressed inward, shaped a veteran's view of himself, and informed the quiet, steady work he did in the decades after the guns fell silent. When military historians and audiences recount the assault now, they do so with both admiration and a measure of sober reflection. The numbers still matter for credibility. 75 yards crawled in 18 minutes, 11 grenades used, some 175 rounds expended, a 10-inch wound nearly touching the spine, 13 hours hiding in sauerkraut brine, killing 2 guards with 4 rounds during an escape, 3 days of evasion in freezing conditions, 43 sutures closing the back wound. Medal of Honor presentation on April 23, 1945. Those figures serve to root the episode in the physical world of supply, of timing, and of human capacity. Yet the meaning of the story cannot be fully captured by numbers alone. It rests also in the textures, snow turning granular under a man's weight, the metallic staccato of an MG-42, the acid tang of preserved cabbage, the small, steady hand of surgeons, and the quiet offices where a veteran later worked to help others. Respect for life, discomfort with killing, and the habit of deflection from praise were part of Dunham's character. He lived a life that refused the easy narratives of cinematic glory. To fellow soldiers, he was a leader who acted when the line of sight and the chain of command were no longer sufficient to preserve life. To the civilians who read his citation, he became a symbol of individual courage. To himself, he remained largely a man who did what needed to be done, then returned to the tasks of living and tending the obligations of a peacetime society. The mattress cover, stained dark against white snow, finally returned as a fitting emblem for the whole story. Its starkness captured the immediate violence and the enduring cost. But if the red on white framed the assault, the barrel and the steady hands of surgeons framed the aftermath. If admiration for bravery is natural and appropriate, it must be balanced with the recognition that such actions also leave traces, medical, psychological, and moral. History remembered Dunham as a soldier who, amid freezing winds and raking fire, made decisions that cost him and that saved others. It labeled him with an epithet that echoed both the mechanics of his assault and the oddity of a man who moved through a battlefield like an explosive device in human form. Yet the simplest, truest account is quieter. A leader improvising under fire, a wounded man refusing to be removed from his duty, a survivor enduring capture and escape, and a veteran who dedicated himself afterward to the service of fellow soldiers. If this account moved you, consider sharing it with others who value the preservation of such histories. Leave a comment about a veteran you know or a story that deserves remembrance. These are the small acts that keep memory alive. The slope above Hill 616 returned to its winter business in the months that followed. Snow hissed, men marched, and the war moved westward. But for the men who survived that January morning, the stain on the mattress cover and the line cut up the hill were permanent. The story of how a walking grenade defied the precise mechanics of the MG-42 and opened a lane for 120 soldiers remains not just a tale of daring, but a cautionary human account of what courage often costs and what duty sometimes demands.